So we've been talking about translation and culture since morning. Um, Now, the moment we talk about translation, how do we react? For example, whenever I go and tell people that my thesis is on translation studies, the first question they ask is, "Oh, translation studies, from which language to which language did you translate?" That's what they ask. Actually, I don't do translation at all. So, but then that's the question I get: from which language to which language do you translate? In other words, somehow, you know, the moment we talk about translation, language comes to our mind. Okay, you can't talk about, or at least that's how it is. Nobody talks about translation without invoking language. So language always gets foregrounded. Okay, so translation is about language, is how it is normally understood. This is the usual approach. So there is a source language, you take and put it into another language, the target language. So always language gets foregrounded. To such an extent that it is almost commonplace to say, if translation is not about language, then what else could be about language? After all, something is written in one language, you have to put it into another language. So translation must be about language. That's how we all talk about translation. That's how it is usually talked. But then we will take this question now. Can we limit translation merely to language? So because in the morning we heard, language is only at the surface. There are many things happening behind it, many things happening beneath it. So should we limit translation only to language? What happens if we, limit translation only through language, only to language? This is the question that we will take. Now, in order to, get some understanding of this question, our discussion will be focused around ideas migrating from European languages to Indian languages. This is what I've been working about in the last few years. What happens when ideas migrate from European languages to Indian languages? What happens when ideas migrate from Western culture to one of the languages of Indian culture? That will be the focus. Okay. Now, Bible translation is one domain that we've been working around. So I'll talk about the research in Bible translation that we've been looking into. And I will use this specific example, very specific example of translation of these two concepts, spirit and soul. Now, how are these two concepts translated into Indian languages? Now, in India, into Indian languages, the Bible was translated from 17th century, began with Tamil, later on Sanskrit, spread across different languages in India. In Kannada, for example, which I've been focusing on, began from 1836, 35-36. So what happens when these two words become a part of the Bible of Indian languages? How do we understand the problem of translation? Now, to understand this discussion, first, let's get a hang of how Christians talk about these words, how the missionaries talk about these words. So here is how Christians talk about these words. For the Christians, God is spirit. Okay, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. There's another example. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. Now, this is how spirit is used largely. There are some deviations, but largely spirit is always associated to God. So God is spirit, spirit of God, spirit of the Lord God. Now there is also, for example, you must have heard this use called the Holy Spirit. Again, he is God's spirit. So spirit is very closely associated to God. This is how the missionaries understand spirit. Now look at soul. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Now this you is referring to a fellow human being, another human being. So you must love your God with your soul. In other words, soul is associated to a human being. Spirit is associated to God. Soul is associated to a human being. For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So soul is about man. It is a component of a human being. Soul is man's soul. Truly, my soul rests in God. So again, soul is about man. Spirit is about God. Now, this is how these two words are understood in Christianity. Okay, now, the missionaries had to translate this into Indian languages, spirit and soul. Now, you must understand something very important. To translate these two terms correctly, appropriately, adequately is extremely important if you have to tell people about their relationship with God. Why? Because for human being, soul and spirit are very integral components. They are the most required components, according to Christianity at least. Why? Because this is how the story goes. God pulled out the dust from the ground. He made a model of a man, and then he breathed his breath into the model. And this breath is his spirit, apparently. So he breathed his breath into the model, and then this model became a living soul. It became a human being. So this model has God's spirit in him, because of which he becomes a soul, living soul. So now you have to tell this story in Indian languages. You have to translate these words in spirit and soul into Indian languages. And how did the missionaries do it? Here is the example. I've used the same English verses in Kannada and in Hindi. So, Devaru Atmaswarupanu. This is how it is used in Kannada. Atanannu ಆರಾಧಿಸುವವರು ಆತ್ಮೀಯ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸತ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ತಕ್ಕ ಹಾಗೆ ಆರಾಧಿಸಬೇಕು. Now in Hindi, this is how it is used. परमेश्वर आत्मा है और अवश्य है कि उसके भजन करने वाले आत्मा और सच्चाई से भजन करे. Now, how many of you think this line makes any sense to you, Hindi speakers? Bhajan we understand, but what does it mean to say आत्मा में भजन करना है, सच्चाई में भजन करना है, आत्मा और सच्चाई में भजन करना है? Well, it's okay. Now, the second one, for all those who are led by the Spirit of God or sons of God, ಯಾರು ದೇವರ ಆತ್ಮನಿಂದ ನಡೆಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತಾರೋ ಅವರು ದೇವರ ಮಕ್ಕಳು. In Hindi, जितने लोग परमेश्वर के आत्मा के छलाया चलते हैं वे ही परमेश्वर के पुत्र है. Third one, Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. I don't know why the Hindi has gone down. Anyway, it doesn't matter. See, basically, Atma is about God. That is how Spirit is about God. So Parmeshwar ke Atma hote hai Hindi mein. Devaru Atma Swarupanu Kannada mein. So somehow you have to, ensure that while you translate, this relationship between Atma and Parmeshwar gets, tightly related. You can't separate Atma and Parmeshwar. Now, Parmeshwar is God. Should God be Parmeshwar? That's another debate. We will not get into that now. But these two have to be somehow tightly knitted together. Okay? So this is how they translated it. Now look at how they translated soul. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Soul becomes prana. In Kannada also it is prana. In Hindi, तू परमेश्वर अपने प्रभु से अपने सारे मन और अपने सारे प्राण और अपनी सारी बुद्धि के साथ प्रेम रख. So soul becomes prana. Okay. Now, for what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? ಲೋಕವನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಸಂಪಾದಿಸಿಕೊಂಡ್ರು ಪ್ರಾಣ ನಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಟರೆ ಅವನಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಯೋಜನವೇನು? in Hindi, यदि मनुष्य सारे जगत के प्राप्त करे और अपने प्राण की हानि उठाया तो उससे क्या लाभ होगा? So prana is soul. Okay. Now, truly my soul find rest in God. Enna manake shanti devanindale. Now here soul is man. Okay. सचमुच में परमेश्वर की और मन लगाया हूं. हाँ, लगाया हूं. Yeah. In Hindi, you don't have too many versions as of now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So now, if you take this translation seriously, there are at least these two observations that you can make. Okay. The first one, the missionaries are consistent in using Atma for spirit. Okay. So wherever there is spirit, it is Atma only. But whenever it is soul, they are a little flexible. Prana comes, manas comes, man. So they don't mind being flexible in translating soul. But spirit, they're very persistent to ensure that spirit is prana. Okay, now, sorry, atma. Okay, now they're very consistent. They don't want to, use any interchangeable closest word, better translation, nothing doing. Now, our problem begins from here. Most interesting problem begins from here. When ideas internal to Christianity, like spirit and soul, when we pick it up, what happens? Because see, we also talk about Atma. They used Atma for spirit. Indians also talk about Atma. Now, if I ask you this question, how do you talk about Atma in English? How do you talk about Atma in English? Come on, you use that word, haven't you not? Soul, no. That's, I mean, what better word can we find? Yeah, correct. I mean, see, now there's something happening here. In one way, in what you use once, you don't use the next time, but you don't see why is this change happening? What is the internal dynamic? We don't seem to ask that question. Okay, now, so Indians also talk about Atma, but when Indians talk about Atma in English, it is commonplace to use soul, right? Missionaries never use soul as Atma. Well, anyway. Now, Gandhi once said this, all religions are true. Okay. So there's one scholar who makes this comment about Gandhi's comment. What is the comment? If all religions are true, then Christian, Islamic, and Hindu teachings should be true at the same time. This entails that one religious doctrine, which claims that each human individual has a unique soul destined for eternal salvation or damnation, should be compatible with another, which asserts that there is transmigration of souls between individuals. This seems impossible. Now, whatever the meaning of those lines could be, the important thing is, if you say all religions are true, then what Christians talk about Atma, what Christians talk about spirit must also be here. But the problem is, we don't know what it is, we use soul. This becomes the problem, right? Now, look at our Gita translations. One, I've used Aurobindo's translation. This is how he translates one of those lines. I, O good Akesha, am the self which abides within all beings. Self is the word used for Atma. Now the missionaries used spirit for Atma. Indians not only use soul, Indians also use self. Okay, now, what does it suggest? It suggests multiple usages possible, at least for the Indians, when we talk about these things. This suggests multiple usages while talking about Atma. Self sometimes, soul sometimes. Now, here is what happens. This is not just about the commonplace usage. This is how even the dictionaries tell us. Now, suppose you never knew, how to talk about Atma and you went into your dictionary. This is what it also says. It's in Kannada, but doesn't mind. Atma is the word. And look at how the Kannada to English words come. Atma is soul, consciousness, character, nature, disposition. Missionaries don't use this way. They never use this way. Okay, now, again, it goes back below, the supreme or the universal soul, one's self, the self. So self comes in, okay, consciousness comes in, soul comes in. But when we talk about Atma Jnani, Atma Swarupananu Ballavanu, one who realizes oneself, again, self is the word used. Atma Trupti, self-satisfaction, again, pleasure of the soul, soul also creeps in. Atma Droha, self-deception. So what do we understand when we talk about these words, which we have picked up from Europe, which we have picked up from the West, what they use in a very strict sense, we don't mind using it in a very loose sense. Not that we are disrespectful about things, but somehow these things don't occur to us. Something stops us. Okay, so we don't mind using soul, we don't mind using self. I looked into some Hindi dictionaries also on Google. Psyche is also used. Yeah, for Atma, psyche. Okay, so in Christianity, if you say Atma is psyche, that's a big blunder. You can't talk that way. Because psyche is about human being, it's not about God. And psyche is something, it is the devil's workshop. If you say Atma is devil's workshop, it's a blasphemy. Okay, so now some more observations. If you say Atma is soul or self, I mean Atma is soul or self the way Indians use it, that's how we use it. But we don't say soul realization to talk about Atma Jnana. We all talk about Atma Jnana. No, when we talk about Atma Jnana, we say self-realization. We don't say soul realization, which means what? I mean, self-realization is how we use it. Even though we use soul many times to talk about Atma in our commonplace ideas, as a commonplace idea, but when you talk about Atma Jnana, somehow we keep aside soul and we use self-realization. Now, but if Atma is spirit to a Westerner, then Atma Jnana must be spirit realization for him. Okay, but then that is not intelligible at all to anybody. And then self-realization for the Westerner, they use this very specific word actualization actually. They don't use this term to talk about Atma Jnana. When Westerners talk about self-actualization, they're talking about the development of the human person, whatever that means. Okay, so in this cross-cultural exchange of which is deeply theological when it comes to India, the way we use it in our conversations, this intercultural exchange leads to two things. We can say two things about it. First, we can say ambiguity about these ideas when used cross-culturally as translation for each other. We see that missionaries are persistent about using spirit for Atma, which Indians do not seem to understand. These are the two things we are left with. These are the broad observations that we can make out of this whole discussion. Now, this leads to some questions. Now, what are the questions? Why are the missionaries so persistent in using spirit to translate Atma? What makes Indians not see the missionaries' persistence, but use either self or soul to translate Atma? Now, this question comes up, but there is also a bigger question. The bigger question is this merely a problem of language? Is this merely a problem of language? Or as we were talking in the morning, language is only in the surface. There are many things, other things playing, behind it, beneath it. So what kind of a problem could that be? I will try to even give you an answer. Now look at this. Missionaries are persistent. Why? For the following reason. For missionaries, spirit is divine. We spoke about this. Okay, God is spirit. So in translating spirit, they had to find an equivalent word in Indian languages which captures the idea that spirit is divine. So what equivalent did they find? Look, this is what they found. They found Atman is associated with the divine. Thus only Atma can translate spirit, because when we talk about Atma, we talk about Atma in association with Brahma. Atma Jnana, Brahma Jnana, these are the associations we make. So they thought if Brahma is divine at all, then spirit should be Atma, because spirit is divine. Spirit is about God. Okay, now this is why they're very persistent. Soul is okay, you can relax. Soul is okay, I mean, you can take chance. Not really, but I'm only trying to emphasize that, they are very persistent about spirit being Atman. Now, the problem is not simply of language. Why? Because they are searching for associated words, associated concepts. If spirit is divine, then is Atman about Brahman? Are they associated to each other? How are they associated? So it is about association of concepts, not simply about, words. Okay, so the problem is not simply of language, but of concepts and identifying associated concepts. Now, let's call it cluster of concepts or topos, as we spoke in the morning. Now, how do these work? How do these cluster of ideas work? Let's see. So every culture, when they talk about ideas internal to their cultural experience, we were talking in the morning, Arti has its own cluster of ideas working behind it. Like that, when Europeans talk about, let's say, soul or spirit, there are associated words. For example, soul, when they talk about soul, idea of salvation is, knitted to it. Then sin is knitted to it. Soul is so deeply knitted to sin. That's why it also requires salvation, which is another associated concept. And this is about man, a human man. So if you want to talk about soul, you need at least these things. There are much more. These play, beneath the language, these are the ideas that give some kind of reference to soul. We were talking about sense and reference. So if you want to make sense of soul, these are the reference points. In the same way, if you want to talk about spirit and make sense of spirit, there are reference points. For example, breath of God, divinity, Holy Spirit. So there are reference points to understand, to make sense of spirit. In the same way, talk about Atman in Indian culture. Again, it has reference points. For example, Atman is para. Atman, when we talk about it, we invoke this idea of Atma Sakshatkara. Atman is Brahman. Now there are reference points because of which you make sense of the concept, sense of the words. Now, what does it mean? It means we see that different cultures have totally different set of concept clusters. Now, here is the move that we are making. The problem of translation is not therefore about language, but in knowing that cultures differ differently, that their conceptual worlds are different. You don't have to expect this conceptual world to be here. You don't have to expect that conceptual world to be here. If cultures are different and if they differ differently, the concepts and the clusters around the concepts, need not match at all. But the problem is, if you don't recognize that cultures differ differently and that the conceptual worlds are different, and if you simply think it is about language, where you go find one equivalent, then this is what happens. You bring soul and put it here, but the associate clusters don't match. Soul makes sense here. Soul doesn't make sense there because there is no reference. The reference points to understand soul is removed there. The reference points to understand soul are here. You can understand soul with these reference points. With those reference points, you can understand Atman. But this is what happens when we talk about soul, when we want to actually talk about Atman. So we want to talk about Atman, but you use soul, and you don't recognize this is the consequence. Right? So reference goes, you can't make sense of it. Neither can you make sense of soul, nor can you make sense of Atman, because the reference points are gone. Now I'll use the same question very quickly, introduce another example. Here is where I want your participation. Okay, now I'll use this translation of Henry Wotton's translation of B.M. Shri, done by B.M. Shri. So Henry Wotton has this poem called Character of a Happy Life. B.M. Shrikantaya, actually, that's the full name. He is still well known. He's no more. He is a very well known poet in Kannada literary world. He is called the father of Renaissance. Because of the emerging modernist movement in Kannada, he was one of the forerunners. His only wish was to see Indians and Europeans successfully, having conversations with each other. He uses this phrase in Kannada. He writes, "Avala uduge nivalige tottu noda bayasuve nodi hada bayasuve." I want to dress that woman with the Indian cloth, and I want to dress this woman with the European clothes. And looking at that, I want to sing. I wish to sing. But in other words, he was actually referring to, I want to ensure that cross-cultural exchanges happen in terms of ideas. But the problem is, does it happen? Could he possibly do it? He thought translation could do it. He took up translation in terms of, ensuring that such a thing happens. So he translates a lot of English poems into Kannada. So 1926, his compilation of translated works compilation of poems, translated poems come. It's called English Gitegalu. And in English Gitegalu, you find the translation of Character of a Happy Life. And this is how the English line begins in Henry Wotton's poem. The line goes like this: "How happy is he, born or taught, that serveth not another's will." In Kannada, this is how he does it. "Enu sukhiyo, ತಾನು ಹುಟ್ಟಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಲಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬನ ಇಚ್ಛೆಯನ್ನು ದುಡಿಯದಿರುವವನು. That's the Kannada translation. For the Hindi audience, I've tried to put what BM Shri has tried to say in Hindi. We just try to put it. This is what he means. BM Shri means. वह कितना सुखी है जो जन्म और शिक्षा में दूसरे की इच्छा नहीं स्वीकारता, पालना नहीं करता. So now, in order to take the discussion a little further, what I have done is I have broken the lines, the translated lines, into simple segments so that we can which would be helpful for the discussion. Now this is how it will look if you break it into smaller segments. The first line, he who does not do another's ichha in his birth is a happy individual. This is how BM Shri is translating the English line. Okay. He who does not do another's ichha during learning is a happy individual. This is what BM Shri means in his translation. Now I have a question for you. Read the first line. He who does not do another's ichha in his birth is a happy individual. Now I want some of you to try and explain this line. Can you try and explain these lines? You know what he's saying? He's saying when a child is born, in his birth. Now, in his birth means when? During birth, just after birth, just before birth, maybe 5 years after birth. We don't know. In his birth, BM Shri says, if a child in his birth does not do another's ichha, then he is a happy individual. Correct. See, that is how you can interpret the line. But let's not interpret now. Let's read the translation. This is how he has translated the line. Now, what would you understand from this translation? If I say, in his birth, an individual's birth, if he does not do another's ichha, he will be happy. He is a happy individual. How would you make sense of this line? No, how do you make sense of the line? Can you explain that line? Yeah, we will say, but why, how? Why should having free will make you happy? We don't know. Do you know? Yeah, ichhe. Ichhe is what is used to translate will. You have pointed out that rightly. But try to explain this line. For example, Sangeet is born, just now born. Okay. Now, if BM Shri is correct, if BM Shri's lines are true, then if Sangeet has to be a happy individual, in your birth, what should you do? You should not serve another's ichha. According to the translation of BM Shri. Now, what does it imply? It means you should not do, for example, as your mother says, if you have to be a happy individual, because that is mother's ichha. If you want to be happy, you should not serve another's ichha. Right? If you want to be a happy individual when you are born, maybe just after your birth, maybe 1 year down the line, if somebody teaches you something, no, you should not do that. Yes or no? This is how you can make sense of the line, isn't it? Or is there any other way you can make sense of it? Sorry? That is how you're interpreting it. But look at the line, read the line. But now look at our experience. When a child is born, if it doesn't do according to the ichha of its parents at least, can it really grow up happy? Grow up to be a happy individual? Then something must be problematic here. Yes or no? Now look at this. Second one, he who does not do another's ichha during learning. Well, when you learn, you go to a teacher, you find a teacher, you want to do exactly what he does, you want to reproduce. But he is saying, if you want to be a happy individual, Sangeet, don't do what your teacher says when you are learning. That's what the line is saying. That's not our experience at all, isn't it? Why do you go to a teacher? Why do you try to find a guru? Why do you do, very rigorously whatever is asked for about, whatever is asked of you to do? Because you want to be happy. But he is saying, don't do if you want to be happy. Because that's some other's icha. You should only do your icha. Imagine what icha could an ignorant man have and then do it and then become happy. So there is something problematic about this line. Do you see that? Yeah? Now, we will go to wood. We will go back to wood. We will very quickly go back to wood. Now, let's assume, let's become charitable, little charitable. Okay, there is some mistake, we will correct it. So how to correct it? Let's offer a better translation. So let me propose one better translation and see whether we can understand the English line through these Kannada lines. Right? Now, I think this is better translation. You are welcome to give an even more better translation. But this is what I think is a better translation. He who is born not to serve another's will, that is, he who is born to only serve his own will, is a happy individual. What I have basically done, I have described it a little bit so that understanding becomes easy. What did we understand is a different question. We don't know still what we have understood. But I am trying to describe it, elaborate it a little. Now, he who is taught not to serve another's will, that is, he who is taught to only serve his own will, is a happy individual. I have a little, described it, that's all. And I think this is a better translation. Well, maybe this is a better translation, maybe this is not. Maybe you can give a better translation than this. Day after tomorrow, somebody else can give a better translation than this. But the point is the point really about going on giving better translations or trying to understand in my language what Wooten is saying? Because that is what translation is supposed to do. It should help you understand what somebody is saying in your language. That is why you translate. Otherwise, why translate at all? Right? So now, we just discussed this. Experientially, we know that he who is born does do according to another's icha. We also know that he who learns according to another's icha. So we neither know, no is missing there. We neither know what is written in our language in the translation, nor do we get access to what Wooten is saying. Right? Now, what should we do? We will find an alternative way to make sense of Wooten. What could be the method? First method, very simple. Let's go to dictionary. As Sangeet pointed, will. Let us see what will is. Why go for will? Especially because if you read it carefully, it looks like there is some association with doing or not doing will and being or not being happy. So this being or not being happy is closely associated with doing somebody's will, one's own will. Will seems to play a central role. Let's go and see what dictionary says about will. Now, will in the noun form is a faculty or mental ability, since it includes ability to decide, which allows an individual to choose, decide, desire for, or wish for something. Now, this is what all these dictionaries say. Right? So what we will now do, now that we know the meaning of will, what we will do is we will read the line using the meaning instead of the word will and see if we can make sense of Wooten. Now, this is how the reading goes. How happy is he, born or taught, that serveth not another's faculty or mental ability, which allows an individual to choose, decide, desire for, or wish for something. Now, did it help us understand Wooten? Kannada translation did not help. Hindi translation did not help. Does the dictionary meaning help? How happy is Sangeet who doesn't, who does not serve another's faculty or mental ability to choose, decide, or wish for? You don't understand simply because you don't know why serving somebody, another mental faculty, wish, this ability to choose, why should these things decide happiness? What is that relationship? Why not I do another switch and be happy? Why not I decide to choose to do my teacher's itcha and then be happy? Why not do another sitcha and try to be happy? This question you can never answer. So dictionaries let you down. Dictionaries don't help. What else can we do? Let's see. So see, even if you use dictionaries, we are left with these questions. Why does serving another's will not lead to happiness for Wooten, while we think the opposite? What is the relationship between serving, not serving will to be, to be happy, or serving will to happiness? So where do we look for an answer? There is one way to look for an answer. And why did I choose this way? Because if you look at Henry Wotton, biographies of Henry Wotton, or at least the critiques of Henry Wotton, very clearly say he was a Protestant militant in the medieval Europe. So when he wrote, they were deeply religious poetries that he wrote. So if it is a religious poetry, best way to find what will is not the dictionary. Rather, we will go and see some theology, what will is in Christianity, in Christian theology. Now, in theology, in will is the image of God in man. It is a faculty by which man chooses. You choose, which is why it is free will. You may choose, you may not choose. If you don't choose, consequence is different. If you choose, consequence is different. Anyway, so it is a faculty by which man chooses to act according to God's plan for the individual. So that is will. Yeah, there is the crux of the whole point. We will come to that. Hmm. Not to choose. Yeah, when I don't know. That's the problem. Correct. For example, must have heard of Moses. He was very old. He's about to die. So what does God do? He calls another man called Joshua, very obedient guy. So he makes Joshua stand before the people of Israel. And what Joshua says, look, you are free to choose whether you want to choose the path of God or you want to run away from here. 40 years God has led you, and you are just steps away to the promised land. Now you are free to choose. So God has given you this choice to choose. Okay. Now, if you don't choose and go, then you're not. It's a different consequence. But you have that choice. Okay. So that is what will is. We will come back to this. Wait. Now, see, God has given you this option to choose. But what is interesting is God has a plan for every individual human being. So God has a plan for Harshit, God has a plan for Sangeet, God has individual plans for all the individuals that he has created. Now, if you want to be happy, the best way to be happy is know what is God's plan for you and do it. That's the Christian proposition. If you want to be happy, do what is God's plan for you. Therefore, why do you want to serve another's will? Serve your will. Your will is the image of God in you. You know what you are supposed to do to be happy. You know what God wants you to do to be happy, or at least find out what is God's plan for you so that you do it and be happy. Why do you go serve another's will? Why do you want to go and do God's plan for somebody else? Because it is somebody else's problem to find out what is God's plan for him, do it and be happy. So what is the secret for happiness? For Wotton at least, a Protestant militant, what is happiness? Happiness is serving one's own will. Why? Because one's own will tell you what is God's plan for you. And if you choose not to do, consequences, you will be unhappy. You will lose the presence of God. God threw Adam and Eve out of the garden. They lost his presence. That is the consequence of free will. If you don't choose, you will be unhappy. So how to be happy? Do your own will. So who is a happy man? Happy man is he who is born not to serve another's will. Now do you understand Henry Wotton? So who is a happy man for Wotton? He who does not serve another's will is a happy human being. Because if you serve another's will, that is not God's plan for you.
And what he should do, what he should not do, evolved. And specifically his poetry and the people who talks about will, even today, even the atheists will not go outside this. The only thing that go out is the religious connotation. For example, if you want to take another example, if there are somebody from you can read Malthus' theory. Malcolm Malthus, very famous, all management guys. They're exactly the same framework. You have to discover your own self. That is Kannada translation.
That is BM Shri.
That's Kannada translation. So he's raising the issue because will is noun. Icha is not a noun. So there are a lot of other consequences. Anyway, he will deal with that.
See, that's the question. Does this Kannada
Shashank.
translation, if you read it, does it help you to understand the English one? Conscience.
And it is also of biblical origin.
Yes.
And it has religious connotations attached with it, which cannot be done away with. So will is also having the similar kind of connotations, inalienably attached with it.
Debates in Constituent Assembly, if you read it, you will know. And the extraordinary comedy is happening. Anyway.
So let's come back to our question. Is translation merely about language then? If you want to translate will into, Indian languages, is translation merely about language, the way it is commonly understood? Even among the scholarly community, that's how they understand. So, as we were discussing in the morning, language is important for knowledge acquisition, but something more happens beneath language. So if translation has to become a good condition to acquire knowledge, which let's say Henry Wotton was trying to understand, then you can't make it simply a problem of language. Okay, so is translation merely about language, the way it is commonly understood even among the scholar community? Now this is what we think. We argue that it is about understanding concepts. So it is a problem of understanding, it is a problem of knowledge, understanding concepts that tell us about the experiential world of different cultures expressed in language. So language is just that. But if you fail to express properly, when do you fail to express properly? Is when you don't understand all these things that happen beneath. So this is what is the problem of language, is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.